Picture the endless prairie stretching out beneath a fiery sunset, the wind whispering through the tall grass like ghosts of centuries past. A lone wagon wheel, half buried in parched earth, stands as a silent witness to the trials and triumphs of a young woman's desperate journey. Sarah Mills, a widowed settler, clinging to her faith and her 2 children, has been betrayed and left for dead by the very people she thought she could trust, her in-laws. As storm clouds gather over this unforgiving land, a surprising beacon of hope arrives in the form of a solitary Cheyenne scout. And from that moment on, destiny begins to write a perilous, breathtaking chapter in Western lore. Sarah Mills had never imagined her life would veer so far from the calm upbringing she had known in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. She was born Sarah Hastings, the youngest daughter of a small-town blacksmith named William Hastings, and she had grown up in the gentle embrace of a close-knit community. She learned to hold her head high with quiet dignity and to place her trust in hard work and devotion to family. That was all she had needed. Back in those days, a father's love, a mother's unwavering prayers, and the promise of a future that might shine just a little brighter than the generation that came before. Her path toward the West began with a marriage to a young man named Thomas Mills. He was tall, dark-haired, with eyes that sparkled like morning dew when he laughed. They met in Pennsylvania when Sarah was just 17, and to her girlish eyes, Thomas stood as the very embodiment of an adventurous pioneer spirit. He was several years older, having done a stint as a wrangler on a ranch in eastern Kansas. He had returned to Pennsylvania to tend to some family affairs and raise funds to strike out on his own again. When their paths crossed at a local barn dance, Sarah found herself drawn to his stories of wide-open plains and endless skies. She had never been west of the Appalachian foothills. To hear him speak of a horizon so vast it swallowed the sun every evening sounded like something from a grand novel. They were wed within 6 months. A simple ceremony in the modest church where Sarah's parents had worshipped for years cemented their commitment. Soon enough, they loaded their meager possessions onto a wagon and set out for the frontier. Sarah was barely 18. The world seemed boundless and brimming with possibility. This was the latter half of the 1860s, a time when railroads were inching across the land, but large swaths of the territories remained largely uncharted and wild. Thomas was convinced the West was full of opportunity, land to homestead ranching to be done, fortunes to be found. And so they settled on a patch of land near the Colorado-Kansas border after a year of traveling, scouting, and saving. The ground was rocky in places and the winters harsh, but the grasses grew tall enough for good grazing and the streams provided precious water. Together, they built a small wooden cabin. Thomas took on every kind of work he could find, breaking horses, mending fences, even a bit of hunting when necessary. Sarah learned to tend a vegetable patch, churn butter, and gather wild herbs on the plains for medicine. Life was hard, but undeniably full of hope. In time, 2 children came along, James and Caroline, bright-eyed and curious, the living proof that with love and perseverance, anything could grow in the West, even a family. Yet it seemed the West held as much tragedy as it did promise. In the 8th year of their marriage, Thomas fell gravely ill. No one knew precisely what it was. Some suspected pneumonia or a deadly fever contracted from a nearby contaminated well. The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away, and by the time he arrived, the illness had ravaged Thomas's body. Within 10 days, he was gone, leaving Sarah a widow at only 26, mother to two youngsters scarcely old enough to understand what had happened. One moment she had a partner to face the storms and hold her hand through the nights. The next, she was alone with a half-finished cabin, a modest patch of farmland, two small children, and a truckload of heartbreak. Thomas's parents, Jeremiah and Augusta Mills, showed up shortly after the funeral. Sarah had written them out of courtesy, letting them know their son had passed. Since they lived in St. Joseph, Missouri, she assumed they would make the journey to pay their respects, but she could never have foreseen the cascade of troubles that accompanied their arrival. Jeremiah Mills was a stern man, a stocky figure with a thick gray beard and hawkish eyes. Augusta, his wife, was high-strung, prone to clutching her lace handkerchief dramatically at the slightest upset. They arrived in a wagon of their own, bringing trunkloads of clothing and personal effects as though they planned a lengthy stay. At first, Sarah thought it was their grief driving them. Their son was dead, after all, and they might want to linger over the few possessions he left behind. But it quickly became clear that Jeremiah and Augusta had a different agenda. They cast critical gazes over the cabin, the barn, and the few head of livestock Sarah and Thomas had managed to acquire over the years. Instead of tears, Sarah heard them talk of land deeds, water rights, the possibility of the Transcontinental Railroad eventually passing through the territory. Their eyes lit up when they discussed the rumored discovery of gold to the west. A subtle but unmistakable tension seized hold of Sarah's chest as she listened. All she wanted was to bury her beloved and mourn in peace. But the in-laws were more interested in potential profits and the value of every corner of the property. "When did you say you would return to Pennsylvania, child?" Augusta asked with a forced sweetness. "Surely you can't manage all this alone." Sarah felt her heart pound. "I wasn't planning on leaving," she replied. "Thomas and I built this place from the ground up. It's our home, and James and Caroline, this is all they know." Jeremiah's eyes narrowed. "You can't farm it by yourself," he said flatly. "There's a water shortage this year, and without a man's hand, you'll see the place stripped bare by winter. Mark my words, I'll find a way." Sarah insisted, though. Deep down, she wasn't sure how. "I have neighbors who are kind. I can hire help with any funds left after the harvest." Their conversation went on like this for days, a subtle dance around the real issue. The in-laws wanted the property, or they wanted Sarah and the children off of it. Their true aim, however, remained unclear, until the night she overheard them whispering by the fireplace. She had gone to the small loft above the main room to check on the kids, and on her way back down, she paused, catching their hushed voices drifting below. "Plenty of acreage for a ranch operation," Jeremiah muttered. "We can hold on to it or sell it to that railroad fellow who's been nosing around these parts." Augusta's voice was sharper than usual. "What about the children?" she asked. "They're our grandchildren. How do we handle this?" "What we have to," Jeremiah said in a low growl. "Thomas may have built this place, but he did it with my money, my help. The law will be on our side if we press her." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was her home, the one she had toiled over, hand in hand with Thomas, the only security her children had left. She worried about how to confront them, how to defend herself, when after all, Jeremiah was half right. She didn't have any significant money. Life insurance was unheard of, and the property deed was in fact in Thomas's name. The law in many territories did not favor widowed women, especially if the father's living relatives contested ownership. Her best bet might have been to appeal to a federal land office, but traveling that far with her children in tow and lodging a formal claim would require time and resources she didn't have. That night, she cried silently in her bed, praying for strength and guidance. Little did she know how quickly her predicament would worsen. A week later, Jeremiah announced that he had visited the local magistrate and discovered that the property deed was in a precarious state. He claimed that since Thomas had not made a formal will, the land would revert to the next of kin, namely the father. Sarah argued that she and Thomas had joint ownership, but in this territory, the law was murky at best. Some recognized the idea of joint marital property, many did not. Exasperated, Sarah attempted to strike a deal. "If you let me stay, I'll continue to work the land. I'll pay a share of any profits from the crops or livestock. Just don't take my home away." But Jeremiah was unmoved. "It's not personal," he said, rubbing his calloused hands over his beard. "We have our own future to think about." Augusta, for her part, seemed mildly conflicted, but her husband's iron will prevailed. "We're sorry, child," Augusta murmured, though her eyes betrayed a flash of something that might have been greed or perhaps relief. 2 nights later, while Sarah was putting her children to bed, Jeremiah cornered her in the cabin's main room. Without so much as a hint of pity, he tossed a small pouch of coins on the table. "You'll leave tomorrow," he declared. "That's enough to get you started elsewhere. A stagecoach runs from the next town east, heading toward the Mississippi. If you hurry, you can catch it." She looked at the pouch. There couldn't have been more than a handful of silver coins in it. Certainly not enough to relocate 2 children hundreds of miles away, let alone start anew. "You can't just banish us. My children, your grandchildren, need a home." His expression hardened. "I'm doing you a favor. If you don't go willingly, we'll see about having you forcibly removed." Sarah's mind spun. She couldn't believe that the same people who had once welcomed her warmly at her wedding were now cast as her greatest foes. But for the moment, she didn't see a path forward. That night, she quietly packed a few clothes and food supplies, certain that as soon as the children woke, they would set out. When dawn broke, Jeremiah impatiently loaded Sarah and the children into a small, rickety wagon, gave them a single barrel of water, some dried meat, and the meager coins, then pointed them east. "Good luck," he said tersely. The ride was a nightmare. Sarah had to steer along a narrow trail with only a basic sense of direction, gleaned from the few times she and Thomas had traveled to the nearest trading post. James and Caroline, wide-eyed, gripped each other in the back of the wagon, occasionally asking where they were going or when they could go home. Sarah's heart broke each time she told them, "I don't know." At midday, they halted to let the horses drink. The water barrel was precariously low. Jeremiah's so-called generosity had been half rations at best. Sarah mentally calculated how much farther they had to go and how much water remained. Fear settled like a stone in her stomach as she realized they might not reach the stagecoach line at all. Around twilight on the 3rd day, as they traversed a rocky outcropping near a shallow ravine, a terrible jolt rocked the wagon. One of the wheels gave way, battered into splinters. The wagon lurched violently. Sarah barely had time to cry out before she and the children were thrown from their seats. She managed to shield Caroline with her body, but James tumbled hard, scraping his arm. Despite the pain, he bit back tears, trying to be brave. Sarah scrambled to check them both. "Are you all right?" she asked in a trembling voice. They nodded, though tears shone in their eyes. The wagon's front axle was hopelessly bent. The wheel was gone, having rolled away and off a ledge. The horse, spooked but unhurt, was still tethered to the remains of the wagon. Sarah realized with dread that they were stranded. She took stock. Some of the food was intact. The water barrel, however, had cracked upon impact. There was precious little water left, maybe a half-gallon. The next town, Sarah had no idea how far, maybe 20 miles, maybe more. She knew traveling on foot with two small children in the scorching heat was almost suicide. Yet staying here could be just as fatal. Night fell with an eerie quiet. Sarah set up a small camp beneath a lone cottonwood near the ravine. She laid out blankets for James and Caroline, giving them sips of water and a few pieces of jerky. She tried to keep their spirits up, telling them stories of better days, like the time Thomas had taken them fishing in the creek and Caroline had tried to catch minnows with her bare hands. For a fleeting moment, the children giggled at the memory. But soon enough, reality slammed back into Sarah's heart. She had no map, no working wagon, and no help. Unless a miracle arrived, they would be among the countless unknown souls who perished on the frontier, their bones bleaching under an unforgiving sun. She spent a fitful night with an ear to the wind, half expecting the call of coyotes, or worse. At one point, she thought she heard a distant horse neigh. Instantly, her body tensed. Could it be outlaws, Indians, drifters? Anyone out here could spell disaster or salvation. Gripping an old rifle Thomas had left behind, she strained her eyes in the darkness, but she saw no one. Morning light found them exhausted and parched. Sarah gave the children the last of the water. She kept a small swallow for herself, but her throat felt raw. Her lips cracked. "We have to walk," she said half to herself. "We can't stay here." They gathered what they could carry. Sarah led the horse, hoping they might ride it part of the way. But the horse was skittish, and none of them were strong riders. Still, she reasoned they could use it to carry supplies, or even speed up their progress. After traveling for an hour, under the blazing sun, James tripped over a loose rock and fell, hitting his knee. Caroline began to cry, softly, frightened, and too thirsty to produce tears. Sarah realized they wouldn't last much longer in this state. Despair pressed on her like a heavy weight, threatening to break her spirit entirely. And that was when she saw movement on the horizon, a solitary figure mounted on a horse. The figure paused, then urged the horse forward, riding slowly in their direction. Sarah's first reaction was fear. There had been numerous tales of violent clashes between settlers and various tribes, including the Cheyenne Sioux and others. She knew these tensions were real, but she also knew that native people often suffered from wrongful attacks and broken treaties. Her mind spun with the possibility that this lone rider might be an enemy or a friend. But given her situation, she had no choice but to hope for the best. As the rider approached, Sarah could make out that he was dressed in buckskin leggings, a leather shirt decorated with quillwork, and a pair of moccasins. A single eagle feather adorned his hair. His face was resolute, but carried no obvious sign of hostility. He reined in his horse a few yards away, observing them with cautious interest. Sarah swallowed hard, letting go of the rifle. She raised her hands slightly to show she meant no harm. James and Caroline stood behind her, trembling. The man spoke in a quiet but clear voice. "Are you hurt?" It startled Sarah to hear English. His accent was pronounced, but the words were understandable. She hesitated a moment, then nodded. We've been stranded. The wagon broke. We have no water." He glanced at her children, noticing James's scraped arm and the overall state of their fatigue. Dismounting with deliberate care, he approached, leading his horse by the reins. He opened a small pouch at his side and produced a canteen. Sarah's eyes widened. She had no idea how much water was inside, but even a single mouthful might be enough to revive them. He handed the canteen first to James, who took a careful sip, mindful of his mother's warning that they shouldn't gulp water too quickly when they're dehydrated. Then Caroline, eyes wide with desperation, sipped next. Finally, Sarah took her turn, rationing herself to a few swallows. The water was lukewarm, but it felt like life itself, coursing down her throat. "My name is Yellowhawk," he said, quietly. "I am Cheyenne." "I'm Sarah Mills," she answered. "This is James, and that's Caroline. Thank you for the water." Yellowhawk observed them for a moment, then nodded. "You cannot stay here. The sun is harsh, and there is little water for many miles." She nodded in agreement. "We know, but our wagon—" Her voice cracked. "We don't have the means to travel." He glanced at the sorry remains of their wagon, then turned back to Sarah. "I can help you." Relief and caution warred within her. She was grateful, yet uncertain of his intentions. Still, he had shared his water, and they were in dire need. "Thank you," she managed. By late afternoon, Yellowhawk had helped them salvage what they could from the broken wagon. He fashioned a rough travois from some of the intact timber, hitching it to his horse. This could carry the children or the supplies while Sarah walked alongside. They set off in search of a water source, with Yellowhawk leading the way. That evening they reached a sheltered hollow where a small spring bubbled from the ground. The children ran to it, kneeling and cupping the water in their hands, too young to mask their delight. As Sarah watched them, tears welled in her eyes. She couldn't shake the feeling that Providence had led this Cheyenne scout to them. For the next few days, Yellowhawk guided them through the rugged landscape. He said little about himself, except that he was once part of a larger band that roamed these plains. Over time, the conflicts with the U.S. Army, the movement of settlers, and forced relocations had scattered his people. Many had been pushed onto reservations, while some, like himself, tried to adapt scouting or guiding occasionally for cavalry units or wagon trains, though it was always a delicate arrangement. Even as he led them with a steadfast calm, Sarah sensed a quiet sorrow in his eyes. She saw it in the way he studied the horizon at dusk, as if recalling memories of a different time, a free world that was now slipping away. Yet in that sorrow, there was also a kindness, a willingness to help strangers in desperate need. The children grew fond of him. Caroline especially took to asking him endless questions about the flowers or rocks they encountered. In turn, Yellowhawk would point to a bloom and teach its Cheyenne name, or show her how certain stones could spark fire when struck together with steel. James, initially shy, found himself impressed by the scout's archery skills. He would watch raptly as Yellowhawk demonstrated how to shoot an arrow into a distant stump with uncanny accuracy. One afternoon, Sarah took a moment to speak with him, while the children napped under the shade of a cottonwood tree. "You've done more for us than we could ever repay," she said quietly. "I don't know how we can thank you." Yellowhawk shrugged. "Your children are alive. That is good. You will find a place to stay?" Sarah sighed, her eyes brimming with uncertainty. "I don't know. My in-laws forced me off our homestead. I have nowhere to go now." The plan was to head to the next town for a stagecoach east, but we never made it. "And even if we did, I have so little money." He studied her face for a moment, then turned his gaze outward. "There is a fort not many days from here. Soldiers have built a town around it. Maybe you can find work or shelter." The mention of a fort made Sarah uneasy. She knew that some forts were safe havens, while others were hubs of tension between the army and the tribes. But given her situation, it might be her best shot. "All right," she said softly, "let's try for the fort." And so they changed course, slightly following a meandering river that edged northward toward the rumored outpost. Along the way, Yellowhawk hunted small game for them, rabbits, squirrels, and taught Sarah how to set snares. In quiet moments, he showed James how to mend his torn pants with sinew, an improvised skill that left the boy fascinated. Over several days, Sarah discovered that trust can grow even in the harshest conditions. She came to rely on Yellowhawk's expertise, his quiet confidence in reading the land. She felt safe with him guiding them, a feeling she never expected she would have in such perilous times. Their journey eventually brought them to the outskirts of Fort Laramie, a bustling outpost that had grown into a sizable settlement. Surrounded by log and stone walls, it bore the marks of a place in transition wagons, rattled in and out, carrying supplies, half-built storefronts promised expansion, and the occasional uniformed soldier patrolled the dusty thoroughfares. As they drew near, Sarah could see apprehension flicker across Yellowhawk's face. The Cheyenne scout had guided cavalry units in the past, but the relationship between the army and local tribes remained fragile. She worried that he might be greeted with suspicion or outright hostility, especially since many folks in such frontier towns harbored deep prejudices. They passed through the gates around midday. Almost immediately, a few soldiers turned their heads, noticing Yellowhawk Sarah and the children trailing behind. Sarah felt tension coil in her stomach. She clutched Caroline's hand a bit tighter. A small group of men approached them. One wore the insignia of a cavalry officer. He had a weathered face and a broad-brimmed hat, angled low, shading inquisitive green eyes. Afternoon, he said, his tone more curious than aggressive. "Everything all right here?" Sarah spoke up, determined to stay composed. "My children and I have been stranded on the plains. We were rescued by Yellowhawk. We just need a place to rest and figure out our next move." The officer sized them up, then cast a glance at Yellowhawk. "Yellowhawk, you say? I've heard the name." He paused, then extended his hand to the Cheyenne man, though somewhat stiffly. "I'm Lieutenant Daniel Cunningham." Yellowhawk nodded, taking the hand in a brief, civil greeting. Sarah let out a quiet breath of relief. No guns had been drawn, no harsh words flung. Lieutenant Cunningham gestured toward the inner courtyard. "We can get you some water and maybe some hot food. There's a small boarding house just outside the fort walls. The proprietor, Mrs. Carter, might have a room available for you and your children." He turned to Yellowhawk. "You're welcome as long as you don't cause trouble, but we have to register you at the quartermaster's office. Just a formality." Sarah threw Yellowhawk a concerned glance, unsure how he'd feel about that. The scout said nothing, simply nodded. "I will speak with them." And so they followed the soldiers into the fort. Sarah and the children were shown to a makeshift mess hall, where a cook handed them bowls of stew and cups of water. Though the stew was thin and the bread stale to Sarah and the children, it felt like a feast. Meanwhile, Yellowhawk was escorted to the quartermaster's office to register his presence. Sarah worried about him, but he returned shortly afterward, quiet and unruffled. Over the next 2 days, Sarah discovered that life around Fort Laramie was bustling yet precarious. The stage lines did run through here. An eastbound coach arrived once a week, heading toward the major railroad hubs, but the fare was more than Sarah could afford. She did manage to find temporary lodging at Mrs. Carter's boarding house, paying with the last of the coins Jeremiah had tossed her way. After that, she would be penniless. She was at a crossroads. Returning east without money was impossible. Remaining here meant she would need to find work, a difficult proposition. Most women who hung around forts either cleaned, cooked, did laundry, or pursued less savory occupations in the saloons. Sarah was determined to keep her dignity intact for the sake of her children. Meanwhile, Yellowhawk seemed restless. He visited the local Indian agency official to ask about his people. The official told him that many Cheyenne were being pressured onto reservations in the Oklahoma Territory or forcibly moved northward. The news cast a shadow over him and Sarah could see how deeply it weighed on his mind. But neither of them had many other options. Yellowhawk did not want to leave Sarah and the children alone in a strange place, and Sarah had grown to trust him more than any of the strangers she encountered. Late one evening, sitting on the porch of Mrs. Carter's boarding house, she confided her dilemma. "I can't stay here forever," she murmured. "I have no means, no land, nothing. I'd hoped to find an honest job, but there's nothing suitable that pays enough to support me and the kids." Yellowhawk listened quietly. Finally he spoke. "There may be a way," he said. "I know of a rancher, James Calloway, to the south of here. He sometimes hires men and women to help with his livestock. Perhaps he will take you on." Sarah's eyes lit up with fragile hope. "Do you think he might?" Yellowhawk nodded. "He is fair. I have met him before, guiding for the cavalry. His ranch is near the Sweetwater River, maybe 3 days' ride from here." It wasn't much of a guarantee, but it was something. Sarah swallowed, considering the leap of faith it would require. "Will you come with us?" she asked softly. A faint smile ghosted across Yellowhawk's lips. "I will make sure you arrive safely." After a brief meeting with Mrs. Carter, who despite her occasional sternness seemed sympathetic, Sarah settled her final bill. The next morning, with Yellowhawk's help, they acquired a used wagon from a traveling merchant who had run short on funds and was willing to barter. Sarah exchanged a couple of her last personal items, some silver spoons that had once belonged to her mother, and the small ring Thomas had given her on their 3rd anniversary. The ring was dear to her heart, but the man insisted on something of real value. Through tears, she made the trade, determined to give her children a chance at stability. With the wagon in hand, they restocked supplies, dried beans, flour, salt coffee, and a small cask of water. Lieutenant Cunningham, seeing they were leaving, offered a handshake and a half-smile of encouragement. "Good luck," he said. "God knows we could use more decent folk out here." And so they set out for Sweetwater. Yellowhawk rode alongside on his own horse, guiding Sarah and the children in the wagon. The land to the south gradually shifted from rolling plains to a mix of rocky bluffs and grasslands. Occasional stands of cottonwood and willow hugged the banks of winding creeks. On the second day, they encountered a traveling preacher named Reverend Samuel Black, who was heading in the opposite direction. He greeted them warmly, tipping his battered hat. "Good day, madam, and to you as well, sir," he said, nodding toward Yellowhawk with a respectful bow. He introduced himself as a circuit preacher who ministered to folks on the frontier. They shared a quick meal of salted pork and beans. The Reverend offered a prayer for their safe passage and gave the children small wooden crosses. "Faith will see you through," he said with a kind smile. That same night, they camped near a shallow stream. Sarah was awakened in the pre-dawn darkness by the sound of muffled hooves. Peering out from under the wagon cover, she spotted movement, 2 silhouettes in the distance, creeping closer. An instant dread filled her. Were they thieves? Rustlers? She reached for the rifle, her heart pounding. Yellowhawk was already awake, crouched behind some rocks with his bow. When the strangers realized they'd been spotted, they approached, openly calling out, "Hold your fire! We're just travelers." Their voices were raspy, unsteady. One was a wiry man with a patchy beard, the other a lanky companion with shifting eyes. They asked for water and food, claiming to have run out during their journey. Sarah, always compassionate, might have helped, but something about them felt wrong. Their glances drifted repeatedly toward the wagon, and the children still huddled inside. Yellowhawk signaled to her to stay back. He gave the men a small portion of water in a canteen, but sternly refused further requests. "Ain't you got any coffee or fresh bread?" one man whined. "We can pay." Yellowhawk shook his head. We have enough only for ourselves." The men persisted, and Sarah's anxiety mounted. She noticed one of them had a revolver tucked into his belt. The tension was palpable. Then Caroline let out a soft whimper from inside the wagon, betraying their presence. The men exchanged knowing looks. Finally, Yellowhawk drew himself upright and said in a low, commanding tone, "Leave now." His stance, combined with the fierce gleam in his eyes, brooked no argument. After several tense moments, the two men slunk away, cursing under their breath. Sarah exhaled the breath she'd been holding. She realized just how vulnerable they truly were, and how fortunate to have Yellowhawk protecting them. By midday of the third day, they saw a stretch of fenced pasture land that signaled civilization. A battered sign near the road read Callaway Ranch. Tall grass swayed in the breeze, and in the distance they could see the faint outlines of barns, corrals, and a modest homestead. Smoke curled from a chimney, suggesting someone was at home. They pulled up to the ranch house, a sturdy two-story structure with whitewashed planks. A lean man in his 50s emerged wearing a wide-brimmed hat and dusty trousers. His face was weathered, but wore a genuine smile. "Hello there, I'm James Callaway. What brings you folks to my spread?" Yellowhawk dismounted. "I remember you," he said quietly, "from Fort Laramie. You had the contract to supply horses to the army." Callaway's eyes lit with recognition. "Yellowhawk, right. Yes, I recall you helped guide a wagon train through Pawnee territory a few years back. Good to see you again, friend." Then he turned to Sarah and tipped his hat. "Ma'am, what can I do for you and your children?" Sarah swallowed her nerves and stepped forward. "Mr. Callaway, I'm looking for work. My husband passed, and we lost our homestead. I can cook clean, tend to animals, work in the fields, whatever you need." Callaway studied her for a moment, glancing toward the children. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "You've come a fair distance by the looks of it. Let's go inside, and you can tell me your story. Maybe we can work something out." They followed him into the house, a modest but welcoming space. Callaway introduced them to his wife Clara, a kind-faced woman who wore her hair in a loose bun. The children were offered cool water and homemade biscuits. In hushed, halting words, Sarah recounted their misfortunes, Thomas's death, the betrayal by the in-laws, the rescue by Yellowhawk. She concluded with a plea, "All I want is a chance to make an honest living and a place for my children to rest their heads in safety." Clara clucked sympathetically, her eyes misting with tears. "My goodness, you poor dear." "James, we've got plenty of chores around here." James nodded gravely. "We do, and our own ranch hands have been clamoring for more help in the bunkhouse. But I'll not have a widow and her kids bunking with the men." He paused, thoughtful. "We've got an old foreman's cabin out back that's been empty. Needs some patching up, but it might serve as a home for you if you'll do the cooking and housekeeping for the ranch hands. We'll pay you a fair wage, and you can keep a garden out back. In time, if things go well, we might find you something better." Emotion flooded Sarah's chest. She grasped his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "You won't regret this." Callaway turned to Yellowhawk. "And you? Will you stay on? I can offer you work breaking horses or scouting the far pastures." Yellowhawk hesitated. Sarah saw the uncertainty in his eyes. He was a wanderer by nature, a man caught between two worlds. Still, he nodded. "I will stay for a while," he said simply. And so a new chapter began. Over the next week, Sarah and the children settled into the foreman's cabin, scrubbing floors and patching leaks. Yellowhawk repaired the broken shutters and replaced a few missing shingles. Clara supplied them with old furniture enough to make the cabin feel like a real home. James and Caroline found themselves enthralled by the ranch animals, the horses, the curious goats, and a few barn cats slinking about. For the first time since Thomas's death, Sarah felt something like hope rekindling in her chest. She had a roof over her head, honest work, and the companionship of good people. Yet she couldn't entirely dispel the lingering fear that her in-laws or fate might yet tear this fragile peace away. Summer turned into autumn, and life at the Callaway Ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm. Sarah rose before dawn to help Clara prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. She washed clothes, tended the vegetable garden, and cleaned the main house. In return, she was paid a modest monthly wage and allowed to keep a portion of the produce for her own family. The children spent much of their time either helping with small chores or running across the pastures, exploring under the watchful eye of Yellow Hawk. The Cheyenne Scout quickly proved invaluable. He broke horses gently, using methods that impressed even the most seasoned ranch hands. He also scouted for stray cattle, navigating the terrain with uncanny skill. At night, he'd sometimes join the ranch hands around a fire, quietly listening to their stories or occasionally sharing a tale from his own experiences. But beneath this calm facade, tensions in the region continued to simmer. Word arrived from passing travelers that conflicts between the army and various tribes were intensifying. Ranches had been raided sometimes by renegade bands of natives, sometimes by outlaws disguising themselves as natives. Suspicion lingered in every town, in every saloon, fueling prejudice and violence. One chilly afternoon, a distant rider approached the ranch. Sarah was hanging laundry in the yard when she saw James Callaway stride out to meet the man who wore a black duster and sported a shiny star pinned to his vest. A lawman. Her gut twisted at the sight. Mr. Callaway introduced him later as Sheriff Adam Holbrook from the nearest settlement, Gold Creek. The sheriff explained that he was making rounds, warning locals that outlaws had been spotted in the region, possibly the same men who'd tried to rustle cattle 2 towns over. "Lock your doors, keep your rifles handy," he advised in a gravelly voice. His eyes flicked to Sarah, and the children then landed on Yellow Hawk, who stood in the background. She sensed the sheriff's posture stiffen slightly. "You got an Indian here," he noted, in a tone neither friendly nor outright hostile. Callaway nodded. "He's with me." "Good man." Holbrook shrugged. "Just keep an eye out. Folks are jumpy these days." The sheriff tipped his hat and departed, but the encounter left an uneasy tension in the air. Later that evening, as Sarah and Yellow Hawk walked back to her cabin, she couldn't resist voicing her concern. "Things are getting dangerous," she said softly, recalling how the sheriff's gaze had lingered on Yellow Hawk. Yellow Hawk nodded, eyes on the horizon. "Yes," he said. "They fear what they do not understand." Sarah glanced at her children, chasing each other around the yard, their laughter so pure against the darkening sky. She prayed that this fragile peace they'd found would hold that fear and hatred wouldn't seep in to destroy it. As if her prayers were a warning, trouble did indeed come. One crisp morning, just as Sarah was serving breakfast to the ranch hands, she heard an unfamiliar wagon pull into the yard. Peering out the kitchen window, she froze. Augusta Mills, her mother-in-law, was stepping down from a carriage followed closely by Jeremiah Mills. The sight of them sent Sarah's stomach lurching into her throat. Why on earth were they here? They marched straight into the ranch house as if they owned it. Clara, startled quickly, summoned Sarah. When Sarah appeared, Augusta's eyes lit with a thinly veiled triumph. Jeremiah stood with arms folded, a smug grin curling his lips. "You're a hard woman to find," Augusta said, icily. Sarah's mind spun. She had told no one where she'd gone, except perhaps a friend in Fort Laramie. How had the in-laws tracked her down? Jeremiah wasted no time explaining. Word travels. A friend spotted you at Fort Laramie and mentioned you were heading this way with an Indian. He spat the word like a curse. We decided to come see for ourselves. Sarah steeled herself. What do you want? Augusta forced a sympathetic expression. We heard how you were forced to leave the homestead, dear. We've come to fetch you back. We can see to it that you're taken care of in St. Joseph, where you belong. Sarah stared aghast. When I needed you most, you threw me out like rubbish. Now I have a decent life here. Why would I go anywhere with you? Jeremiah's smile twisted into a sneer. Because we're your children's only grandparents. We have a right to see them properly raised. And you living on a ranch run by strangers relying on the charity of an Indian, this is no life for Thomas's kin. Sarah trembled with anger. You have no claim on us. We do, Jeremiah said firmly. I spoke with a lawyer in Denver. Under territorial law, if you cannot provide proper living conditions for the children, we can petition for custody. A single mother, without a stable home or husband, is often deemed unfit. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. I'm not unfit, she snapped, tears burning her eyes. I have a roof, a job, and people who care about us. Augusta shook her head. This ranch is not yours. You're living on someone else's good graces. She glanced around the modest kitchen with visible disdain. Is this what Thomas would have wanted? Anguish flared in Sarah's chest. She knew Thomas had wanted them to thrive in their homestead. But that had been taken away by these very people. Now they dared to judge her for rebuilding her life. Mr. and Mrs. Calloway, overhearing the confrontation, stepped in. James Calloway drew himself up. Excuse me, he said, politely but firmly. I run this ranch. Sarah is employed here, and we value her work. She and her children have a rightful place in our community. Jeremiah glared at him. You don't understand, sir. These are our grandchildren. We intend to take them back. Yellow Hawk appeared, then his silent presence a stark contrast to the in-laws' bluster. Jeremiah's face contorted with hatred at the sight of him. You see, he hissed at Sarah, consorting with savages. This is an abomination. Fury flashed in Sarah's eyes, but before she could retort, Clara touched her arm. Sarah, calm down, Clara whispered. We can sort this out rationally. Then she addressed the in-laws. Why don't we sit and talk like civilized people? Jeremiah shook his head stubbornly. We've talked enough. If Sarah doesn't come willingly, we'll bring this to court. We've already initiated the paperwork. With that, Jeremiah and Augusta stomped out, leaving behind an ominous threat. Sarah collapsed into a chair, trembling. She felt as if the ground had slipped from beneath her. The children hovered in the doorway, confused and scared. Yellow Hawk laid a comforting hand on her shoulder. She fought back tears. They won't take my kids, she whispered. I won't let them. In the uneasy days after the in-laws' visit, Sarah struggled to focus. Though she continued her work, fear shadowed each step. Jeremiah and Augusta remained in nearby Gold Creek, waiting on legal papers from Denver. They rode out occasionally, their presence a silent threat. Sarah prayed for a solution and found a glimmer of hope in Yellow Hawk's suggestion. There is a man in Gold Creek, he said one evening, Arthur Bloomsbury, a lawyer who helps those without means. With Calloway's blessing, Sarah traveled to town. Inside a small, cluttered office, she explained everything. Bloomsbury, tall and mild-spoken, listened carefully. The Mills are wealthy. This won't be easy, he warned. But he agreed to take her case. If you can prove stability, moral character, and support from reputable people, the court may side with you. We'll need testimony from the Calloways and others, and we'll need to show that you're not compromised by your relationship with the Cheyenne scout. Sarah's stomach twisted. There's nothing improper. He saved our lives. Bloomsbury nodded. Then we'll prove it. The next day, she returned to the ranch, renewed by a sense of purpose. But the in-laws spotted her leaving Bloomsbury's office. Their glares were cold, triumphant. She knew they'd sensed she was preparing for battle. Sarah spent the following week gathering affidavits, rehearsing testimony, and readying for court. Every spare moment was filled with worry about the children, the trial, and the whispers around town. She heard mutterings in the general store, saw judgment in strangers' eyes. But each evening, Yellow Hawk sat nearby, quiet and steady. He never offered false hope, only presence. It was enough. One night, after tucking the children in, Sarah sat by the fire with him. "If I lose them," she began, her voice trembling. "You won't," he said softly. "You are their mother. That truth cannot be taken by papers or judges." His calmness steadied her, and she nodded, more determined than ever. The court date was set. The fight for her children was about to begin. One crisp afternoon, gunshots shattered the calm. Outlaws raided the north pasture, attempting to steal cattle. Yellow Hawk Calloway and the ranch hands fought back swiftly. Sarah, heart-pounding, tended the wounded as the ranch turned into a makeshift infirmary. Among the attackers was a familiar face, the lanky man with shifty eyes who'd once begged them for food. Now he was part of a larger gang. One outlaw was killed, 2 ranch hands wounded. Sheriff Holbrook arrived grim-faced. "They've been disguising themselves as natives to stir up trouble. Stay alert," he warned. In the following days, Yellow Hawk rarely slept, patrolling the ranch boundaries at night. Sarah watched him, deeply grateful and increasingly afraid. The attack made clear just how dangerous the frontier remained. Yet with Yellow Hawk standing guard, she felt they still had a fighting chance. Winter crept closer as the court date loomed. Sarah tried to focus on her chores, but dread clung to her. Jeremiah and Augusta had filed for custody, claiming she was unfit and morally compromised. She had no money for a lawyer until Yellow Hawk suggested Arthur Bloomsbury, a retired Army attorney in Gold Creek. With Calloway's support, Sarah visited the lawyer. Bloomsbury listened carefully, then agreed to take her case. "You have employment, a home, and the respect of good people. That matters," he assured her. "But the Mills have money and connections, so we'll need strong testimony." The hearing took place in a cramped courthouse lit by a single oil lamp. Augusta and Jeremiah sat smugly beside their polished lawyer, Byron Fetters, who painted Sarah as a desperate widow, relying on a savage for protection. They promised the children a proper Christian home in Missouri. Bloomsbury responded with calm determination. He presented evidence of Sarah's employment support from the Calloways and the stability she provided her children. James and Clara Calloway testified in her defense, speaking to her work ethic, kindness, and the children's well-being. Then Bloomsbury called Yellow Hawk to the stand. Gasps echoed. The Cheyenne scout stood tall, his voice quiet but resolute. She protected her children with everything she had. She works hard. They are safe with her. His quiet dignity hushed the room. Fetters tried to rattle him, questioning his English and culture, but Yellow Hawk remained composed, never rising to the bait. After a tense recess, Judge Whitlow returned with his verdict. "Mrs. Mills has proven herself a fit mother. She has employment, shelter, and credible witnesses. The petitioner's actions following her husband's death raise concern. Therefore, custody will remain with the mother." Sarah gasped, tears streaming as she clutched her children. Augusta sobbed. Jeremiah seethed. "You'll regret this," he hissed before storming out. As Sarah walked out of the courthouse into the cold sun, she knew the battle had been won, but not the war. Relief swept through Sarah as they returned to the ranch. The court had ruled in her favor, her children were hers to keep. That night, the Callaways hosted a celebration. For the first time in months, Sarah laughed freely. James and Caroline danced by the fire, while Yellowhawk watched quietly, a rare smile tugging at his lips. But peace didn't last. Days later, under the cover of night, the outlaws struck again, this time with greater force. Gunshots shattered the calm as flames engulfed the hay barn. Sarah shoved her children under the cabin bed, grabbed her rifle, and stood guard, Thomas's old marksmanship lessons rushing back. In the chaos, she spotted the lanky outlaw raising a gun toward her. Before he could fire, a bullet struck his shoulder. He dropped his weapon and vanished into the night. By dawn, 2 outlaws lay dead. The barn was singed, and Yellowhawk, though shot, survived with a clean wound. As smoke still curled from the ruins, 2 riders arrived, Jeremiah Mills and a local rancher. Sarah tensed. "I heard about the raid," Jeremiah muttered. "We came to see if you were all right." "Too tired for confrontation," she answered coldly. "We're fine, no thanks to you." Jeremiah surveyed the destruction, eyes resting on Yellowhawk beside her. After a long pause, he sighed. Maybe we were wrong. A woman who can fight like this, maybe she can raise children after all." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was something. And for the first time, Sarah sensed the wall of hatred begin to crack. Over the following weeks, the ranch slowly rebuilt. The outlaws were hunted down by Sheriff Holbrook, and a posse effectively ending that threat. Jeremiah and Augusta departed, presumably returning to St. Joseph, though not without a final cautious farewell to the grandchildren. While no tears were shed on either side, there was a muted civility that suggested maybe the Mills in-laws would leave them be. Sarah continued her work at the Callaway Ranch, earning enough to purchase a few chickens and a milk cow. The foreman's cabin became a cozy home, warmed by the presence of James and Caroline's laughter. Yellowhawk's wound healed, and he took up his duties again. Sometimes Sarah would catch him gazing at the horizon with that same solemn look, a man caught between 2 cultures, searching for a place to belong. One day, as the sun dipped below the wide plains, Sarah found herself standing beside him. The children ran in the grass behind them, chasing each other with shrieks of delight. She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I owe you my life and theirs," she said softly. I'm not sure I can ever repay that." Yellowhawk turned, studying her face. "You have already repaid it," he replied. "Seeing you and the children safe is enough." He paused as if summoning courage. "I will stay until the next spring if you will have me." Sarah smiled, eyes glistening. "I'd like that." In the distance, a hawk circled against the crimson sky, a lone silhouette, drifting over a land that still harbored danger and promise in equal measure. But for Sarah Mills and her children, saved by a Cheyenne scout's compassion, hope was no longer a wish, but a daily reality built from resilience, cooperation, and faith in a better tomorrow. And so ends the harrowing tale of Sarah Mills, a widowed settler, who, along with her children, was cast aside by those who should have protected her, only to find an unlikely guardian in Yellowhawk, a lone Cheyenne scout. Their journey reminds us that trust, courage, and kindness can flourish even in the most unforgiving landscapes. Through raging storms of betrayal and lawless raids, Sarah clung to hope, and in time forged a new home where her children could thrive. If this story of endurance and unity touched your heart, we invite you to become part of our storytelling family. Please like this video, share it with friends who love Western dramas, and subscribe to our channel for more stirring tales of frontier survival and heroism. Every click, every share, and every subscription fuels our mission to keep these captivating stories alive for generations to come. Thank you for being part of our journey.